Shadows of the Past, Part 5, The Hunt Begins. A visit to the police. The next morning, Mark walked nervously into the local police station. The events of the previous night still echoed in his mind. The brutal discovery of Dr. Carter, the enormous Ceratosaurus, and the eerie silence that followed. He needed answers, and he thought the police might be able to help. "I need to report a death," Mark said as he approached the desk sergeant. The officer raised an eyebrow. "What kind of death are we talking about here?" "Dr. Carter, I found her in the woods, dead. Something killed her. It wasn't human." Mark's voice shook. The officer looked at him with a skeptical expression. "Kid, you need to take a seat. We'll be right with you." When they arrived at the scene Mark had described, the police searched for hours but found nothing. No body, no sign of Dr. Carter, no footprints. "Looks like you've been having a rough time, Mark. Maybe you should take a break from this whole adventure," one of the officers said, giving him a disapproving look. Mark was frustrated, but he knew they wouldn't believe him. After all, it sounded insane. A promise to the farmers. As he walked back from the police station, Mark thought about the cows that had been disappearing. He had to prove to everyone that dinosaurs still existed. He couldn't let it go. He decided to speak to the farmers around the village and offered to keep watch over their livestock. "I'll stay out here tonight. If anything happens, I'll be ready." The farmers were hesitant but desperate. They agreed. Then, that night, Mark sat in his truck watching the cows graze under the pale moonlight. Hours passed and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The night was quiet, and Mark began to think he had been overreacting. Suddenly, a movement in the distance caught his eye. A large shape moved through the trees, its silhouette unmistakable. Mark's heart raced as he realized it was the Ceratosaurus. The creature, its gray body blending with the darkness, stepped into the clearing. It stopped, sniffing the air before it crept toward the cows. Mark watched in horror as the Ceratosaurus lunged at one of the cows, its powerful jaws sinking into its flesh. The cow let out a pained cry as it was dragged into the forest. Without thinking, Mark jumped out of the truck and followed the creature, moving as quietly as possible through the trees. He knew he had to get closer to gather evidence, proof that dinosaurs still walked the earth. The Ceratosaurus stopped under a large tree, the cow's lifeless body still in its jaws. It began to tear into the flesh, feasting in the moonlight. But then, Mark heard something. A faint scratching sound. He turned toward the noise and froze. A velociraptor stood only a few feet away, its sharp eyes glinting in the dim light. Mark's heart skipped a beat. The velociraptor's eyes locked onto his, and before Mark could react, it began charging toward him. Mark ran, his legs moving faster than they ever had before. The sound of the velociraptor's claws scraping against the ground was close behind him. He pushed through the underbrush, trying to stay ahead. He could hear the creature getting closer, but he wouldn't stop. He couldn't. In a desperate move, Mark veered toward his truck, jumping into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut. His hands shook as he turned the key in the ignition, but the engine roared to life. He stepped on the gas, speeding away from the forest. Through the rearview mirror, he saw the velociraptor darting into the trees, but it didn't chase him. Homecoming. Mark arrived home, his mind racing. The truck's tires squealed as he parked in the driveway. He was exhausted, but something felt off. The door to his house was wide open. "Hello?" Mark called, stepping inside cautiously. The house was eerily silent, the faint creak of the floorboards beneath his feet the only sound. He checked the kitchen, the living room. Everything seemed normal until he turned toward the hallway. That's when he saw them. Two velociraptors standing in the shadows of the living room. They stared at him with cold, predatory eyes. One of them took a step forward, its claws tapping against the floor. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He bolted for the back door, but as he ran, he heard the sound of claws scraping against the floor behind him. He quickly dashed into the basement, slamming the door shut behind him. The velociraptors were fast, but the basement door held, at least for now. Mark breathed heavily, his back pressed against the cold wall. He could hear the creatures pacing above, their movements growing louder as they hunted him through the house. Morning comes. The morning sun broke through the cracks of the basement door. Slowly, Mark pushed the door open, his eyes scanning the room. The house was silent. He stepped into the living room, looking around cautiously. There was no sign of the velociraptors. He was alone, but as he stood there, a shiver ran down his spine. Something told him this wasn't over. The nightmare was just beginning.